Welcome back to the LLCO's series on Soviet revisionism. In the last episode, we took a look at the USSR's economic relations with other countries. We found that although those relations were not inherently imperialist, the USSR did exploit other countries to a certain extent. That is because the Soviet Union had deviated from communist principles and put nationalist selfishness and consumerism over international solidarity and world revolution. Today's episode will deal with the USSR's military foreign relations. As with economic relations, the USSR's military relations were not inherently imperialist either. The USSR allowed other Eastern Bloc countries a certain amount of independence as long as they stood on the ground of the Soviet model of socialism and didn't threaten the Soviet Union's security interests. For example, despite Yugoslavia and Albania openly opposing Soviet socialism, the USSR never invaded those countries. Without an inherent economic need to secure markets, the Soviet Union was better off just leaving those countries alone, as long as its national security was not in danger, as they did in the case of Romania joining the IMF. However, the USSR did intervene militarily in the politics of other countries. For example, it helped to repress the East German uprising of 1953. It invaded Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Afghanistan, and it threatened Poland militarily by positioning Red Army troops around its border. How are these incidents to be assessed? They were not inherently imperialist, since economic considerations played only a minor role. In fact, all of these countries profited from trading with the Soviet Union. In the cases of East Germany, the Soviet Union intervened on behalf of the GDR leadership. The GDR leadership, that already suffered from revisionist deviations, had disregarded the grievances of the people and didn't know any other way out than to frame protesters as counter-revolutionaries. The Soviet Union's role consisted of stabilizing an allied government to remove a security threat to itself. While the USSR acted in an ignorant and right opportunist manner, we cannot speak of this action as capitalist imperialist. One could call it social imperialist, but we have already explained our problems with this term. A similar situation in Hungary happened, except protesters had essentially removed Hungary's ruling socialist party, the MDP, from power. If the turmoil had remained unattended, we would have likely seen a bourgeois state emerge from the situation, a serious security threat to the Eastern Bloc countries. The USSR intervened and placed the MDP back in power. While this did resolve the security issue, it was also again a very ignorant move, since the failures of the MDP were the reason for the protests in the first place. The USSR even ignored independent socialist institutions that had formed during the protests, further testifying to its revisionist degradation. In Czechoslovakia, it was the government itself that steered away from the Soviet course and closer towards Western Europe and a liberalization of the economy. It goes without saying that the Soviet Union felt threatened by the possibility of a Western-aligned country in the heart of Eastern Europe. The Soviets' intervention could be justified with the interest of the proletarian movement as a whole if we ignore the revisionist degradation of the Soviet leadership itself. A principled communist at that time would have tried to establish a cultural revolution movement that opposed both Soviet socialism and liberal tendencies. The Polish protest movement was harder to evaluate. Although it emerged from a genuine workers' movement, it eventually ended up being co-opted by pro-Western liberal forces. The USSR's military threats towards Poland should urge the government to get the protests under control before they could get out of hand. Here again, the responsibility lies first and foremost with the Polish ruling party that had ignored the interests of the population and went down the path of revisionism. In this case again, the USSR can hardly be charged with imperialism, but all the more with right opportunism. Here again, a principled communist would have supported the protests in general and tried to steer it towards a cultural revolution. Lastly, we want to take a look at the notorious Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. Although it had been one of the USSR's earliest allies, Afghanistan was never economically nor politically crucial to the Soviets. Neither was an invasion from Afghanistan likely, nor did the Soviets make noteworthy profit by trading with the country. In fact, Afghanistan was one of the recipients of vast Soviet subsidies. But of course, the Soviets had a general geopolitical interest in maintaining good relations with neighboring countries. As the Afghan leadership moved closer in the direction of Soviet socialism, the USSR urged it to stay on a moderate path in order not to receive a backlash from the largely conservative rural population. The USSR declined Afghan requests for military help in fighting the Islamist reaction in the countryside 14 times. After the moderate leader Taraki was killed by supporters of the hardliner Amin, the Soviet Union finally agreed to intervene militarily. It makes sense to assume that the USSR saw Amin as a liability, but it stands for debate whether the USSR outright plotted his assassination or he fell victim to internal struggles. Fact is, Amin died shortly after the Soviet military intervention and was replaced by the moderate Karmal. In helping to preserve a leftist government against the pressure of Islamist reactionaries, the USSR played a generally progressive role in the Afghan war. That is not to say that the USSR didn't have right opportunist nationalist interests at the same time that also affected their handling of the situation. There are many more instances of questionable Soviet foreign policy moves, but they mostly follow the patterns that we have explored in this and the previous video. All in all, we have to conclude that the USSR's military foreign policy was driven neither by capitalist imperialism nor by proletarian internationalism. It would be a superficial analysis to put the USSR's foreign policy into the same category as capitalist imperialism, but it would also be wrong to call it more than right opportunist nationalism. Despite there also being Soviet military aid for anti-imperialist movements that had a progressive effect on world politics, the Soviet-aligned Eastern Bloc countries were in desperate need of a cultural revolution to remove the revisionists from power. And there is no doubt that the Soviet Union would have suppressed any such cultural revolution movement the same way they helped to suppress protests in the GDR and Hungary. The reason for this is mainly the policing paradigm that was present in Soviet socialism and, to a lesser degree, Chinese socialism at the time. In the next episode, we will reassess the Soviet Union's history to try to answer the question why it fell into revisionism in the first place.